This is module 5.4.1, Introduction to Fungi. This introductory slide shows some of the beautiful fruiting bodies or mushrooms that fungi produce. We're going to begin our discussion of fungi, oddly enough, by talking about a non-fungus, the giant sequoia. The giant sequoia is one of the most massive organisms ever to inhabit the earth. It's over 270, the largest ones grow to be over 275 feet tall. They can live to be over 3,000 years of age. This isn't the tallest trees in the world. The coastal redwoods, a different species, are over 300 feet tall, and some of the Australians claim that they had trees, eucalyptus trees, that were over 300 feet tall, but they cut them down. But we know Australia was founded by convicts, and so they might not be telling the truth. The tallest trees in the world are probably here in America. The age of these trees, 3,000 years, is quite long, but nevertheless, these are not the oldest trees. The oldest trees are the bristlecone pines, and they inhabit the White Mountains of California, not to be confused with the White Mountains of eastern Arizona. And one single individual, a very large specimen of the giant sequoia, the General Sherman tree, its trunk is estimated to weigh 2.7 plus million pounds. This is the same as 250 African elephants or 11 blue whales. The blue whale is the largest animal ever to inhabit the earth, and so this is quite significant. These trees have the thickest bark of any tree, some 20 inches. They provide the most wood from a single tree. The wood from one tree can fence an 8,000-acre ranch and shingle 80 houses. Of course, it depends on the houses and the type of fence, but nevertheless, a lot of wood. The only thing that saved these trees from being completely cut down and exploited for their wood is that it took several weeks to cut one down, and when they fell, they typically shattered because the wood was quite brittle, making all that work for nothing, that no sawable timber remained. When they first cut a section of a trunk and sent it back east to one of the world's fairs, everyone believed it to be a hoax. These trees are so immense. On my office door, there's a picture of a giant sequoia in which they've cut a little tunnel, and it shows a Volkswagen driving through this living, standing tree. Of course, the tree is now fallen down. They probably shouldn't have cut that tunnel out, but it shows how big these trees are. With all these superlatives about how big it is, there's one anatomical deficiency. These trees have a puny root system, only 40 inches deep. This is just over 3 feet, and it does extend 50 feet from the trunk, but that's not that far considering the height of the tree. So how do these trees survive? How do they get sufficient absorption from this small root system for these immense trees? The answer better have something to do with fungi, and it does. They form an association called mycorrhiza, and we can learn that mycorrhiza is a mutualistic association between fungi and roots. Mycorrhiza is neither fungus nor plant. It is both. And so if we look at this photo in the lower right of this slide, you can see the little filaments or threads that are coming out. And this is what happens with mycorrhiza. They provide an immense amount of surface area to provide absorption for those giant trees. And we'll talk more about mycorrhiza later. So the association is called myco, which means fungus, and rhiza, which means root. Just by way of introduction, here's really quite a beautiful photograph. If you didn't know, it was fuzzy fungus growing on medium. This is a petri dish that we're looking into here. So this is showing some molds. We didn't have anything of this interesting of color. But just by way of introduction, fungi which do not have sex, which includes many molds and yeast, are sometimes described as imperfect fungi or deuteromycetes. They are classified in this group. Mushrooms are sometimes called fruiting bodies. These are sexual structures, and they produce sexual spores. And we're going to learn that those have great importance in classification among the fungi. And most of the fungal body grows out of sight in the substrate or in the food. In this case, it shows a log with mushrooms on it. The mushrooms are not the entire fungus organism. They're only reproductive structures. The fungus organism is growing inside the log, unseen. Fungi play a critical role as decomposers. Along with the heterotrophic bacteria, they are among the principal decomposers. Remember the FBI when we talked about ecology? FBI stands for fungi, bacteria, and insects, being some of the large scavengers. And especially decomposers. Fungi secrete enzymes to digest nutrients outside their cells. We call this extracellular digestion, and then those nutrients are absorbed, and so they're said to be absorptive heterotrophs when we describe their nutrition. Fungi, at least some of the wood decay fungi, have a remarkable ability. They can break down lignin, which is kind of the glue in wood. Wood is made out of cellulose fibers and lignin resin or glue, and few other organisms can do this, and so it's a very important ecological service that the fungi perform. Some fungi do cause diseases. They act as pathogens for animals and plants. Mycosis is a fungus-caused disease. Fungi also are the source of many antibiotics. For example, penicillin comes from the fungus Penicillium, and they produce these antibiotics to reduce competition from bacteria. And humans take advantage of fungus-mediated decomposition in the production of bread, beer, wine, cheeses, and soy sauce. Quite a list. So if we look at this, mycology comes from the root mykotos, which it means fungus, and it comes from the Greek. So mycology is the study of fungi. There are about 77,000 described species. There are many more, probably as many as 250,000 species of fungi, but many of these are, of course, undescribed and unknown to science. Fungi, interestingly, although they have been traditionally studied in botany classes with plants, they are more closely related to animals than they are to plants. And this table kind of shows this. The K stands for kingdom. You should add it to your table. Kingdom fungi compared to kingdom plantae. And you should start to think in these categories of the taxonomic hierarchy. For example, both these kingdoms are in domain Eukarya. And so we can compare the nutrition. Fungi have heterotrophic nutrition. Plants have autotrophic, using photosynthesis. These guys are absorptive heterotrophs. The body plan of plants, box-like cells, rectangles like we saw in the aquatic plant Elodea, the rigid cell walls of cellulose, which you'll see below. Fungi have a filamentous body plan, these threads, and we will talk about that more later. This next feature about sperm isn't really that critical. Very few plants have mobile sperm. Motile means the same as mobile, so motile sperm in some. Fungi always have non-motile sperm. Again, not a big deal. You can almost cross that one out. Cell walls, though, in fungi have chitin. Cell walls in plants have cellulose. It's an important feature. You should definitely remember that. Mitosis. In plants, it's as we describe mitosis to you in our mitosis lectures. I hope you're not too surprised to learn that it's different in fungi. This occurs inside the nucleus. The nuclei of fungi are very tiny, very difficult to see, so we probably won't be seeing any. But just to let you know, it is different. Again, not a critical feature. You can almost cross it out. Let's look at the features of kingdom fungi. First, these organisms are eukaryotes. They have nuclei and membrane-bound organelles, and they're heterotrophs. They don't make their own food. And we might say eukaryotic absorptive heterotrophs, because that's how they eat. The vast majority of fungi are multicellular, composed of many cells that coordinate for nutrition and reproduction. Exception is the beast called yeast, and yeast are very important economically. Fungi have cell walls of chitin. Fungi have extracellular digestion. They secrete secrete enzymes outside their cells and break down the food. And because of this, they're a source of antibiotics. And we'll talk about how and why that works a little bit later. Fungi have a filamentous body plan. It's made out of thread-like hyphae. And we say all the hyphae of one fungus is called mycelium. I'll show you a slide about that. These organisms reproduce with spores. There are two types of spores. You should write down right out here that there are asexual spores and sexual spores. And the mode of production of sexual spores turns out to be real important in the classification and taxonomy of fungi. These organisms have a zygotic life cycle. This is unlike anything that we've studied so far. For example, animals, the adult animal body is diploid, has two sets of chromosomes in every cell. That is not true of fungi. Adult fungi are haploid, and they have two cells fuse to form a diploid zygote, and that just lasts for usually a very short time, and then the zygote will almost immediately undergo meiosis and again produce haploid spores, which are sexual spores. And we'll see how this works when we look at a life cycle. Talking about the fungus body plan, here's some terms that you do need to know. I did use some of these in passing on the previous slide, but here let's define them. Hyphae are filaments of fungus. All of the hyphae of one fungus, or a mass of hyphae, is called mycelium. And here we can use this photograph to better explore this. This actually shows some fruiting bodies or mushrooms. These are puffballs of some sort, and they are producing sexual spores. And we can see this little black line I've drawn across here that says underground. So we actually revealed what's underground, and we see these thread-like hyphae, and all of the hyphae of one fungus are the mycelium. Notice I've made a little notation here that I say that the fruiting body of the mushroom is usually above ground, but not always. Consider the case of truffles. You may have heard of truffle pigs or truffle dogs, animals with a keen sense of smell that go after truffles, these very desirable underground fungi. They co-evolved with squirrels. Squirrels typically will eat these fungi, and then the spores pass out in the squirrel droppings. So kind of interesting. Hyphae can elongate very quickly, and although here in southern Arizona it's not an ideal mushroom climate, I lived in California previously, and many people have lived in other places, and you can see this phenomenon where you go to bed and there's no mushrooms, you wake up and there's lots of mushrooms. It's like they appeared, but in fact there were little buds, and the hyphae just elongated and they became visible overnight. It's quite interesting. Here's how we're going to define a mushroom. It's a fleshy reproductive structure that produces sexual spores. So that's a mushroom. Mushroom is to a fungus as a grape is to a grapevine. You can pluck the grape off the grapevine, no problem. You can pluck the mushroom and not kill the fungus as well. Note, although we call mushrooms fruiting bodies, they're not fruit, and so you shouldn't be confused by that idea. So here's some mushrooms there. This actually shows some hyphae, and this is we just turned over some leaves on the forest floor, and there are all these thread-like filaments here. So this would be a massive mycelium made out of hyphae. We can talk about the nutrition of fungi. Remember, all are absorptive heterotrophs. They have extracellular digestion. They secrete enzymes outside their cells onto the food. They digest the food down. For example, they're digesting wood. They would digest cellulose down into glucose, and then they will absorb the glucose. The problem with that is they are liberating glucose in the environment, and the environment is full of those ubiquitous little microbes, including bacteria. And so the bacteria can slip in and yoink the food from the fungus. So evolution has provided a defense for the fungi. They produce antibiotics. Now, antibiotics are very important to fungi because they help to secure their food source from those thieving bacteria. But these antibiotics, these chemicals, are also extremely important to people as they provide a tool or a weapon for us to combat bacterial infections. I liken this to when I was a child and my mother would give me and my brothers cookies, and of course the first thing you do is lick your cookies, but it didn't slow my brothers down, so you had to put a big gob of spit on it, and then they might slow down, but not very long. But you get the idea. It's defending resources and keeping them for oneself, and that's what the fungus is doing when it produces antibiotics. So fungi are really an excellent place to search for new antibiotics, as most known species have not been closely examined and many undescribed species exist. Now, the development of new antibiotics is not very lucrative. It's not going to make a lot of money. Drug companies instead focus upon drugs that people are going to use all the time, like, for example, blood pressure medicine or something like that. In one's lifetime, you might only have one major bacterial infection that needs an antibiotic, as opposed to buying drugs every day. And so this is why you really do need to understand the importance of government science, government research. They will spend years on thankless research with little possibility of financial return just for the good of society. And so this is a good deal for society, and you should support science in this sense. But you should also be aware of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. That's why we do need new antibiotics. This actually shows, you should recognize this from our microbiology lab. This is a petri dish, and that smear back and forth is actually the bacterium Staphylococcus growing. And we can see some penicillium here, and we can see a zone of inhibited growth, this area where the antibiotics are being secreted to keep the bacteria away from the fungus. Pretty cool. Fairy rings are actually evidence of the growth pattern of fungi. You can see we get these kind of rings, and it's because a spore starts in the middle and it grows radially outward, and as it grows outwards, it consumes all the nutrients in the center, and so it's like a donut of fungal mycelium. And then when the fungus fruits or produces mushrooms, they're in a ring. These rings are called fairy rings. And so on the left, we can see one in a lawn. In the center, we can see a natural fairy ring in a meadow. On the right, we can see one in a lawn. But look how green the ring of grass is. Why is that? It's because the fungi are using extracellular digestion. They're breaking down the nutrients that are in the lawn, that are out there, the dead grass and stuff. And the living grass is using it as fertilizer. And so it's kind of an interesting phenomenon. Of course, the reason these structures have the name fairy rings is because it was believed in mythology that they formed when a fairy danced in a ring. So here's our dancing fairy, and here, let's see her make some fairy rings. Okay, there she goes. Wow. Yep, definitely caused by a fairy. Or maybe not. Okay. We used to be able to calculate the growth rate of fungi. Well, we can calculate the growth rate of fungi by extrapolating back. We can see from one year to the next, how far did this grow? We can extrapolate back, and we can figure out how long before that ago was that spore starting to grow there in the center. And from that, we can, again, calculate the age of these structures. And we used to think that fairy rings were the largest examples of mycelial growth in fungi, but in the early 1990s, it was discovered by fungal genetics researchers in the forest. They went out and they sampled, and they found, man, they kept genetically analyzing this mycelium, and it was bigger and bigger and bigger. And it covered 37 acres. And they thought it was at least 1,500 years old to have grown that far, and it weighed about 100 tons. And this was published as a serious journal article, but it caught the attention of the news cycle, and it was dubbed the humongous fungus. And there was a huge media blitz. Probably most of you don't remember. But around that time, we found several other examples of humungi fungi, or humongous funguses. I'm not sure how we're going to say it. But this is really a cool kind of photograph, because this is not grass or a lawn or a meadow. This is a coniferous forest. These are, I think, Douglas fir. This is in Montana. You can see 3 examples of what look like varying growth there. And so pretty interesting stuff. And with that, we're going to conclude this module.